Last year, the Executive Secretary of the African Capacity Building Foundation said that the amount of money Africa is losing through corruption might be underestimated. The ACBF said at the time that Africa was losing something in the order of $50 billion a year in corrupt practices, but this could be as much as $100 billion a year. But how do people on the ground experience this corruption, and what do they think about it? Well, that's the subject of the latest Global Corruption Barometer by Transparency International and AfroBarometer. And to tell us more about this report and its findings, I'm now joined via Skype by Gugu Nonjinge, who's the project leader for the Institute of Justice and Reconciliation. Thanks so much for joining us. Welcome to the program. Good to have you.
Thank you.
All right, Gugu, let's start with the purpose of this report. What question were you setting out to find? What were you trying to find out, rather?
Well, the Corruption Barometer is set to pretty much gauge or understand citizens' perceptions on corruption in the continent. We, as AfroBarometer, surveyed about 34 African countries between 2016 and 2018. And then last year, we went and did a research again, including another country, so which makes it a total of 35 African countries that have been surveyed by AfroBarometer, using the similar set of questions that we've asked across all these countries, just to try to, as I mentioned, to understand and kind of gauge citizens' perceptions of corruption and the level at which that they see some of the institutions that operate in their local communities.
So what were some of the key findings?
So we see that corruption is on the rise. That's what the data is showing, according to the citizens in Africa. About 55% of those that were surveyed by the AfroBarometer think that corruption has increased over the past 12 months. Again, many people are seeing that government is failing to do quite enough to address levels of corruption in their countries. But then again, we also picked up that majority of the citizens in Africa say that the ordinary citizen can do a lot to actually address corruption or to fight corruption. However, significant proportions of them actually risk retaliation when it comes to speaking up against corruption in their countries.
All right, so what's the situation in South Africa? You gave us a general view across the continent. What do our percentages look like? What do we think about corruption in this country?
So in South Africa, about 6 in 10, that's 64% of those that were surveyed by the AfroBarometer think that corruption has increased over the past 12 months. And then again, about 70% think that the government is doing a bad job when it comes to tackling issues of corruption in the country. However, what I found interesting for me when it comes to the level or the perception of the increase in corruption in the country, when we look at the survey that we conducted in 2015, which is our round 6 survey, about 83% of South Africans actually said that corruption has increased. However, now in the latest round of surveys, we have about 64%. And that for me shows about 20% decline, percentage point decline of those who actually perceive as corruption has increased. And I feel like that's something that we need to actually look into, in as much as it's still relatively high, but also there has been a drop in the perception of increased level of corruption in South Africa.
All right, so getting back to the continent as a whole, I guess one of the reasons why the level of corruption is underreported is that people are scared to come forward.
Definitely. About 2/3 of the citizens that we spoke to or interviewed as AfroBarometer fear retaliation if they report corruption. Yet they, despite this, about close to half of them actually that they can make a difference. And I feel that also is aligned to the level of trust of these institutions in Africa. It also speaks to civil liberties and how people actually see their freedoms and their political freedoms, the way that they move around and within the continent. In as much as they see that they can do something about it, they do not actually want to speak up. And that for me, again, is also has a direct impact on the lives of the citizens in the continent, not just in South Africa alone. Because it does undermine the integrity and the effectiveness of a majority of African institutions, such as your most basic as police officers and police institutions in the continent.
All right, so what perception do they have about how governments and authorities are dealing with corruption. Do they think that governments are doing enough?
Well, the data does show that about 34%, that is only 1 in 3 citizens, actually think that their government is doing a good job in fighting corruption. In as much as though 59% actually rate their government quite badly when it comes to performing, when it comes to addressing levels of corruption in their specific countries. So that's also not necessarily a good number, but also a number that we need to look into and also take into context what has been happening across the continent. In South Africa specifically, only about 70% actually say that the government is doing horribly when it comes to fighting corruption. Again, looking at the data in 2015 that we collected in our round 6, 79% said the government is doing bad. And that's about 9 percentage point decline compared to our previous survey. So it does show that in as much as levels of corruption and citizens' perception is relatively high in South Africa, however, the government is doing something, seeing that has been a decline in this perception.
All right. So you gave us a clue, I think, in some of your answers. Just wondering if people feel helpless, or do they think that they can actually do anything about this corruption that's happening around them?
Yes, a majority, as I mentioned, a majority of the citizens only do say that they can do something about it. However, most of them, as I mentioned, do fear quite a lot of pushback from the government or from official institutions. I mean, if the most basic level of interaction with government is least trusted by citizens, then chances are of them speaking up against these instances is very limited. In South Africa, for example, the police are rated as the most corrupt institutions. About 5 in 10 of South Africans actually rate them as the most corrupt government official in South Africa. And that, for me, is, again, those are the most basic, most closest to them when it comes to reporting corruption and when it comes to speaking up.
All right. So, again, let me come back to South Africa. And I'm just wondering, of the people that you spoke to, did you get a sense of how much, as a percentage maybe, people that had paid maybe a police officer or somebody a bribe in the last 12 months?
So for those who have paid a bribe, as shown by the AfroBarometer, about 18% of the public service users actually said that they've paid a bribe in the past 12 months. In as much that, as again, that is relatively high. In the last round, about 7%. That's close to about 16 percentage points increase of those who've paid a bribe. As again, it shows that corruption does affect the poorest of the community members in South Africa, and also again in Africa at large. And that's again something that we need to look into quite deeply, because it does hinder the economic and social development, and within, not necessarily in South Africa context, but also across the continent. And also, as I mentioned, corruption is a barrier, quite a major barrier, economic barrier, when it comes to us looking into civil liberties and political liberties, and how citizens actually make their choices when it comes to voting and things like that.
All right. And interestingly, men are more inclined to pay bribes than women.
Surprisingly, men are more inclined. I think also men, it is just a perception, but also men are the ones that are mostly interacting with these official institutions in their continent, in their countries, respective countries, and in the continent at large. So they are most likely inclined to pay a bribe. They are the most ones that drive cars in some countries. So they're most likely to pay a bribe to police officers or to traffic officers. So the data sometimes does mirror or reflect what we see or embedded in our communities.
All right. And then finally, perhaps overall, when you compare the last study to this study, which way is the arrow going? Is the perception that corruption is getting worse, or is it getting better?
I think with South Africa, it is actually going down because, as I mentioned, there has been a slight percentage point decline between our previous round of survey and our latest round, which is about 12 to 10 percentage points decline of those who say that corruption has increased in South Africa. Of those who said that it has stayed the same, again, we see about 8 percentage point. Yes, in as much as there has been change and citizens are seeing the change, majority of them actually still feel that it's still relatively high. So it is a mandate to government to actually take this into consideration and actually actively be involved in how to fight corruption and involve citizens in its fight or in its approaches to curb corruption in the continent and in the country at large.
Gugu Nonjinge, always a pleasure talking to you. Thanks very much indeed for the work that you're doing and giving us this kind of information. Let's hope the authorities can use it some way. Thanks so much indeed.